Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Police are examining CCTV footage which is believed to show a former Russian spy shortly before he fell unconscious in Salisbury on Sunday afternoon. Sergei Skripal is critically ill in hospital after being exposed to an unknown substance.
A woman who was with him has been confirmed to be his daughter. She is also in intensive care. The former double agent had been living in Britain since 2010 when he was pardoned by Russia for giving away state secrets. Joe Tidy reports.
This CCTV footage is now a major focus in this international mystery. It's thought to show former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his unknown companion moments before they fall critically ill. And it's here in Salisbury city centre that the couple were found unconscious. Multiple points of interest have been cordoned off in the shopping area. And an Italian restaurant is also being searched as the 66-year-old man and the woman in her 30s are being treated in hospital. Sergei Skripal was found collapsed in the street on Sunday afternoon. The former army colonel was arrested in Russia in 2004 for working for the British. He was convicted of treason and said to have betrayed the identities of Russian agents operating in the West in return for payments from MI6. A Russian military court sentenced him to 13 years in jail.
Sergei Skripal is found guilty of state treason in giving out state secrets to representatives of foreign agencies.
But in 2010, Skripal became part of a major spy swap at an Austrian airport. He and 4 others who'd been found guilty of espionage were exchanged for Russian spies who'd been caught by the US. Skripal was allowed to move to Britain, where the 66-year-old has lived here ever since. But now he's being treated in Salisbury Hospital, along with his female companion.
The pair, who we believe are known to each other, did not have any visible injuries and were taken to Salisbury District Hospital. They are currently being treated for suspected exposure to an unknown substance. This has not been declared as a counter-terrorism incident, and we would urge people not to speculate. However, I must emphasise that we retain an open mind and that we continue to review this position.
This was the scene last night, police taking no chances with full protective gear. If poison was used, it will inevitably lead to comparisons with the case of Russian defector Alexander Litvinenko. He was murdered in 2006 using radioactive polonium. Despite extensive inquiries, the Kremlin refused to allow the chief suspects to be extradited to Britain, and relations between Moscow and London have never fully recovered. The Russian government's been quick to offer assistance, but says it has no information about this new mystery incident. Joe Tidy, Sky News.
Well, let's take a look at what we know about Sergei Skripal's movements. The former double agent had been living a relatively quiet life in Salisbury after moving there 8 years ago, following an extraordinary spy swap with Russia.
At around 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, he and a female companion were found slumped on a bench at the Maltings shopping centre in the city.
It's believed they were exposed to an unknown substance and police closed a nearby branch of the pizza restaurant Zizi as a precaution.
Skripal and his companion were taken to Salisbury District Hospital, where they are now both fighting for their lives.
Well, Sky's Rebecca Williams is at the Maltings shopping centre in Salisbury and she joins us now. Rebecca, we're seeing that 2 British police officers were admitted to hospital with minor injuries.
Yes, that's according to Sky Sports sources. 2 police officers taken there yesterday, and we've got a few other updates. I mean, just to bring you up to date, this is the scene here in Salisbury. This is where at 4 o'clock on Sunday, these 2 people, a 66-year-old and a 33-year-old, were taken to hospital after being exposed to some sort of substance. We now know that those people were Sergei Skripal and his daughter, Yulia, who was 33. Now, the police can't confirm what that substance is. Toxicology reports are now being done, we understand, at Porton Down. We don't yet know when they'll be available, hopefully today, potentially tomorrow. Now, we are expecting an update from the police. This, of course, is surrounded by mystery here in this very small city of Salisbury. What happened is they have now cordoned off the police many areas in the city. The latest was Zizi restaurant, which is just to my right behind me. We don't know why, whether it was because the couple were eating there before the incident took place. In another development, I've just been into the local gym and they say the police are very interested in some CCTV that was recorded about 3:45 on Sunday. A couple walking on the underpass, which leads out to the area that you can see behind me that's now cordoned off. Now, we don't know whether that was Mr. Skripal or not, but the police are said to be very interested. They also said in the gym that the police wanted a record of everyone who had attended the facility between 3 and 4 o'clock. So this is a fast-paced investigation. Clearly the police at the moment do not know what this substance is. That no doubt will be one of the key developments. We know that counter-terrorism police are advising Wiltshire police, although Wiltshire police are leading on this investigation. But like I say, a lot of mystery surrounding this incident. What we do know is there was a major incident declared at Salisbury Hospital on Sunday. When I was there in the A&E department at lunchtime yesterday, it had all reopened after they had decontaminated the area. But there are many questions still that people have and will need to be answered. But this latest development, that this was Mr. Skripal's daughter, and we now know too that 2 police officers were taken to hospital with minor injuries following this incident.
Rebecca, many thanks.
Well, as Rebecca was saying, counter-terrorism police are now involved in the investigation. Let's get more on that with our Home Affairs correspondent, Mark White. And Mark, the obvious comparison is, of course, the death of Alexander Litvinenko, and the counter-terrorism police will be looking to see if there are any links, any similarities.
Yeah, I mean, we should stress there is involvement from Counter-Terror Command and some expertise that's being offered to Wiltshire Police, but at the moment, as Rebecca was saying there, the lead is still firmly in the control of Wiltshire Police at this stage. That might change in the coming hours. One of the significant factors that may determine who takes over the lead of this investigation will be when that analysis is complete and the details come out from Portendown. Now, of course, Portendown is not too far from Salisbury. It has the expertise in dealing and analysing chemical, radiological or biological elements. So it and its scientists are currently involved in the examination of substances recovered from the scene of this particular incident. Now, in terms of the wider threat, we know that Public Health England are also liaising with Wiltshire Police with a view to assisting if there is any further concern. There is not believed to be at this stage. There was decontamination that was carried out of those individuals that came into contact with Mr. Skripal and his daughter on Sunday, but no further cases, we're told, have come to light thus far. But it is obviously a detailed and a complex investigation. That expertise from Counter-Terror Command may well be invaluable here. As you pointed out at the beginning there, Jane, they were instrumental, of course, in leading that investigation into the death of Alexander Litvinenko back in 2006. Now, in that particular case, the murder of Alexander Litvinenko was carried out by a radiological substance, polonium-210. And that was really important in a way because it helped the police trace exactly where Mr. Litvinenko had been, where this substance had come into the country because it left that radioactive trail. And indeed, it allowed the investigators to go all the way back through British Airways flights back to Russia and to the very pinpoint the very reactor that it came from in Russia. And a public inquiry concluded that they believed that this was an assassination that had been sanctioned at the very highest levels within the Kremlin. This particular substance, we don't know if it's radiological in nature, biological or chemical. That hopefully will come out in the coming hours.
Mark, thanks very much for that.
Well, there's been political reaction to that story this morning as ministers arrived in Downing Street for a cabinet meeting. Sky's political correspondent Beth Rigby is there. What have you been hearing, Beth?
Yes, morning, Gamal. Well, as they came in, the gate at Downing Street where the cars drive in and out is unfortunately broken, but that was fortunate for us because we could ask cabinet ministers what they thought of the Russian spy issue in the case. Everyone very silent, apart from one cabinet visitor, Claire Perry. She said that she was very concerned about the situation. She told me that she'd spoken to the local MP, that's the junior minister John Glenn, overnight, and she did expect an update from cabinet. Up to now, Number 10 and the Home Office both saying that this is a criminal investigation and being very silent on what is going to happen now. But there's obviously questions about whether they will call a Cobra meeting, because is there a public health risk if this ex-spy was poisoned? Is there a public health risk because of that? Also, will there be a statement in the House from from the Home Secretary? Andrea Leadsom, who I asked at the gate, was silent on that. She's the leader of the Commons. And then Gavin Williamson came in, the Defence Secretary, at the dispatch box yesterday. He spoke about Putin. He said that Putin's made it quite clear that he has hostile intent towards this country. And he said we have to wake up to that threat and respond to it. And I asked him, is it a wake-up call? Stony silence, and in he walked. But I don't think that the government will be able to stonewall on this issue. There's lots of pressure for answers around what's been going on. To put it in the context of UK-Russian relations, after the Litvinenko case, there was a public inquiry in 2010. And ever since then, it's fair to say that relations between the UK and Russia have probably been the frostiest since the Cold War. Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, finally went to Russia in December. That was the first visit in over 5 years to see his counterpart. In a press conference after that bilateral meeting, he admitted that things are not easy between us at the moment, and I suspect that this case will just make that relationship even more difficult.
We've been hearing that the Speaker of the House, John Bercow, has granted an urgent question on the government's policy towards Russia. Let's return to our top story, where former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter remain critically ill in hospital after being exposed to an unknown substance.
Well, Bill Browder is a one-time Russian investor who now campaigns against the Kremlin following the death of a colleague in Russian police custody. He's been called Putin's enemy number one, and he spoke to us earlier.
We don't know for sure what's happened in Salisbury. What we know is that an enemy of Russia, an enemy of the Kremlin, a turncoat in their opinion, came to the UK, was here in the UK, and then collapsed on Sunday. So the first suspicion and my operating theory is that this man was a victim of a Kremlin plot to assassinate him. That would be the working assumption until we have information otherwise. Now, if that is what happened, and again, this is a big if that is what's happened, then I wouldn't expect the Kremlin to do anything other than lie. They lie on they lied about Litvinenko, they lied about shooting down the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine, they lied about troops in Crimea, they lie about the Olympics. So we can't trust what they say. But I believe, as a first operating theory, that this man was a target of a Kremlin assassination plot. I was once the largest foreign investor in Russia. I exposed corruption, and in retaliation for exposing corruption, I was deported from the country. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was arrested, put in pretrial detention, tortured for 358 days, and killed in Russian custody in November of 2009. A whistleblower came forward here in the UK, a Russian, who knew about the people behind the murder of my lawyer. He gave us information which allowed us to give information to the Swiss police, who froze accounts of the Kremlin. And in retaliation, he dropped dead in front of his house in Surrey in 2012. And so we've seen a lot of, and then there's many other characters involved in this story. There was another guy named Vladimir Karamurza, who helped me campaign for sanctions against Russia. He was poisoned twice in Moscow. So the Kremlin is absolutely willing to kill. They kill their enemies. They're willing to kill domestically. They're willing to kill abroad, and they're willing to kill with poison. And so I've seen it up close and personal. I know who these people are. This is a very, very dangerous group of people surrounding Vladimir Putin. And when there's anything involved with a Russian mysteriously either dying or collapsing, one has to operate on the assumption that there was something very suspicious about it. Well, there's one thing that can be done, which is they're ready to kill, but they also value their money more than anything. They value their money more than human life. And they have a lot of money in Britain. And there are Putin-connected oligarchs. There are people who are basically holding Putin's money and holding it in the UK. And so I've been campaigning for the last 8 years for something called Magnitsky sanctions, which allows governments to freeze assets and ban visas of human rights violators coming out of Russia. And the Magnitsky Act, which has been passed in the United States, passed in Canada, and partially passed here, is a tool that we could use here to basically go after their weak spot, to go after their Achilles heel, which is their property here. And if we do that, they would respond and they would hold back on future negative actions. The fact that we did nothing after Litvinenko was killed, and the fact that there's not even been a proper police investigation after the man who came to Surrey was killed, is effectively a welcome mat for the Russians to do bad stuff here.
Now, first of all today, police are investigating the collapse of Sergei Skripal, a former Russian agent convicted of spying for Britain, who was found unconscious on a bench at a shopping centre on Sunday. Investigators are trying to identify what substance left the Russian, who was granted refuge in the UK in 2010 under a spy swap, and a woman understood to be his daughter critically ill in hospital. The pair had no visible injuries, and a number of locations in the city centre were cordoned off, while teams in protective gear have used hoses to decontaminate the street. The possibility of an unexplained substance being involved has drawn comparisons with the 2006 poisoning of the Russian dissident Alexander Litvinenko. Well, to find out more, let's speak to our correspondent there, Leila Nathu, and she's in Salisbury. Leila, what's the latest that we know about Mr. Skripal and the woman that was with him?
Well, Joe, we now understand that the woman who was with Sergei Skripal when they collapsed just behind me here on that bench that's currently covered by a tent is in fact his daughter, Yulia. Now, police so far have refused to confirm the identities of the two, describing them only as a 66-year-old man and 33-year-old woman. But we now know that it is Sergei Skripal and his daughter who are still in a critical condition in hospital. Now, just briefly, some background on Yulia. She moved to the UK with Sergei Skripal in 2010 when he was brought over to the UK in that swap. She then moved back to Moscow, but it's understood that she visited her father regularly here in Salisbury in recent years, and she'd recently left Moscow as well to come here to visit him. She also had a brother who it's understood died in St. Petersburg last year. And the family now believe that that is suspicious. And the family are at pains to say that they do not believe Sergei Skripal was a spy for MI6, as the Russians allege, and for those charges that he was imprisoned on in 2006. But police so far are not entertaining any of those strands of inquiry. They are not engaging with that at all. They have simply said they are investigating what happened here. They are looking into how the two became unconscious on this belt. We understand they are examining some CCTV footage that was retrieved from nearby that shows a man and a woman walking just where I am now, and they are trying to piece together the lead up really to the couple being found unconscious here.
Leila, have you any sense from the police or doctors when we can expect the results of what the substance was that killed them?
No, not as yet. They are still describing the substance as unknown, but they are at pains to say that there is no risk to the wider public now. They do not believe there is any risk. We have confirmation that a couple of police officers had been admitted to hospital with minor symptoms. They have now been discharged, and it's understood only one emergency service personnel is now still in hospital, but just with minor symptoms, some reported to be itchy eyes or wheeziness, so no wider risk to the public. but certainly the results of those toxicology tests will be key to the police inquiry to ascertain exactly what they took and how it might have been ingested or inhaled. Now, there are a couple of cordons, a restaurant, a high street Italian chain restaurant just a few hundred metres away now has been called off. A nearby pub has too. So clearly trying to piece together the last movements before those couple were found slumped and almost comatose, according to eyewitnesses, just a few metres behind me.
Leila Nathu, thank you. Before we move on, I must correct the mistake I just made. They are critically ill at the moment. They are not yet dead. Now, we're joined now by BBC Newsnight's diplomatic editor Mark Urban and the Labour MP Chris Bryant. Welcome to both of you. Mark Urban, what's your sense of what's happened?
Well, it's hard to go beyond those sketchy outlines. And of course, I think one should always hesitate to rush to judgment in a case like this until clearly there is some clear evidence from the hospital of what substance may have brought those two people to this state. But one thing we can know quite clearly is that there is form. We know about the Litvinenko case. We also know about a case that we exposed on Newsnight more than 10 years ago, where MI5 assessed that a hit team was being sent to the UK to kill Boris Berezovsky, the Russian millionaire, now also dead, but they stopped it happening. We also know about the mysterious poisoning of a Russian businessman in Weybridge. So there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that there is some kind of policy or practice of attacking and poisoning people in exile in order to send a message.
Are people rushing to judgment here, Chris Bryant, in terms of talking about hostile intent, as the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has said, before we actually know what's happened?
I don't know that he said that in relation to this, has he? He said that in relation to other
He said it yesterday.
signs. In relation to this?
Well, more broadly.
But I think he was referring to something completely different, and I think that's important. We need, of course, Mark is absolutely right to say that we've got to look at the wider picture of Russian engagement, and it is true that Putin's personal record is regularly to resort to excessive violence. Think of Beslan, think of the Moscow theatre siege, think of Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea. I mean, you know, take your pick. And also large numbers of journalists like Anna Politkovskaya, or for that matter, Sergei Magnitsky, working for a British bank, murdered in Russia. So it is a long list, and my anxiety, you're absolutely right, we shouldn't jump to conclusions, but we need to make sure that when we do investigate, we investigate thoroughly. And my anxiety is that over the last few years, I think Theresa May and David Cameron, both as Prime Minister, were culpable in not allowing sufficient investigation. Theresa May, after Litvinenko, wrote saying she refused to have an inquiry because she said she thought that the Kremlin might misunderstand that. Now, I think we have been allowing the Russians to get away with murder on our soil too frequently recently, and we need to put a stop to it. It's in our national security interests.
Teresa Villiers, what do you say to that? Has there been a lack of grit on the side of the British to investigate these things?
No, absolutely not. I mean, all these cases, I'm sure, have been very thoroughly investigated by the police, and as you acknowledge, there was a full-scale inquiry into the death of Litvinenko.
Way too late.
So
and what did we do after the inquiry? Nothing.
I think it is right that not to rush to judgment. I think that the police obviously will be approaching this with an open mind, and if it does turn out that there is a connection with the Russian state, obviously that would be wholly unacceptable and would have a major damaging effect on the relations between the UK and Russia.
Right, hang on, Chris. I mean, Russia has said it has no information about this and that the Kremlin is willing to cooperate. But on the basis of you accusing previous governments of not quite doing enough, let's have a listen to the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott.
I will be writing to Amber Rudd to say that if it does proved to be the case that the Russian state is involved in this latest death, what assurances can she give, both about the rigour of the investigation and where we go from here? I don't like defaulting to a red menace analysis, but we can't allow London and the home counties to become a kind of killing field.
That's Diane Abbott. Mark Urban, what do you make of the Russian response?
Well, self-evidently, if they did have any involvement, they're not going to admit it. I mean, I think the key thing here that we can see for the government is that this is a fiendishly difficult issue for them. We know in the past that both in the case of Litvinenko and in the case that I mentioned before of this attempt to kill Boris Berezovsky, the official assessment in the security service, just a couple of buildings down Millbank here, was that this was Russian state action. Now, that kind of assessment remains highly classified. People in Whitehall were very annoyed with us when we publicised it in the case of the Berezovsky thing. The reason, of course, is that once you bring that out into the open, it demands action, it demands a response. And that is an extremely difficult thing to do, because these plots, by their nature, except when you use something as esoteric as polonium, where you can then give a forensic line, a forensic chain back to a Russian government establishment, they are deniable. And it's self-evident that nobody is going to claim such an attack, if indeed that's what's happened in Salisbury, because the purpose of it is to send a message.
Right, and what action could the British government take? How do you intensify pressure on Russia, which arguably has actually led to the Russian response being tougher? I mean, they've sort of stiffened their resolve, claims of being humiliated by Britain. So what would you suggest?
Can I just go back one step and then I'll answer your question, which is to say that actually it's not just the private security view, it was also the public inquiry. The judge came to the conclusion that this was not only state sanctioned, but that it was personally sanctioned by President Putin. And what did we do? What did Theresa May do? She shrugged her shoulder. We did absolutely nothing. And I think what people like Putin learn from moments like that is they go, well, impunity, we can just do what we want.
So what would you do?
Well, first of all, one of the things we could have done, and I've been arguing for a long time that we should have done, is that we should have the same laws in the Magnitsky law, which applies in the United States of America and in Canada and the Netherlands and various other countries as well. I simply don't understand why Cameron and Theresa May repeatedly have refused to implement that in the UK. They've got another chance coming up in the next few weeks. Once we've got the full, we will need to have a full public inquiry into what has happened in this particular circumstance. And I'm sorry, the reason I spoke over you, Theresa, earlier is because I don't think there have been full investigations in some of the cases. I simply don't believe that all these 13 Russians who are opponents of Putin who've died in this country all personally just suddenly decided to commit suicide. I just don't believe that.
Are you really saying that somehow the police are under pressure not to investigate death on our streets just because of diplomatic reasons? I cannot believe that for a moment. That's the stuff of conspiracy theories. We've got some of the most effective police in the world. They are going to investigate every case, including today's shocking events. And I cannot believe that wider international considerations is ever going to get in the way of the police doing their job thoroughly of investigating these attacks on individuals.
The information I have from security staff is that quite often what happens in some of these cases is that the first view is taken very, very quickly, and suicide is thought as a convenient means of avoiding the dangers of imperiling the diplomatic situation.
Right. What happens now, then, in terms of the investigation?
Look, I think you work a case like this from numerous angles, don't you? I mean, if, as we believe, his daughter came over, there was family reasons for her to come over to be with her dad last week. You analyse things like the CCTV, her travel plans, is there any evidence that she was followed? Of course, looking at if the assumption now is shifting towards was some kind of poison administered in a restaurant or nearby in the park where they fell ill. CCTV analysis once again, who is visible? Is there somebody who arouses suspicion as being somebody who approached them or was very close to them, was in a position to do that? There are so many different lines of inquiry that the police will be looking at, and of course underlying it all, the fight to save their lives in hospital and establish what it is that has made them so ill.
I mean, you won't be surprised, obviously, by the fact that the Russians are criticising the coverage here in the UK, and I presume they will pretty well stick to those lines.
Look, inevitably, and in a sense, at the moment, you can say why not? I mean, there is no evidence of a state attempt to poison Colonel Skripal and his daughter as yet. The problem is, I think, from a Russian point of view and from a messaging point of view, is that they've got form.
And it's just worth you know, if somebody was involved, like Andrew Lugovoy, we think murdered Alexander Litvinenko, was involved, we won't be able to, you know, he got back to Russia very quickly. And of course, the Russian state law refuses to allow the extradition of any Russian citizen. Likewise, Russian state law says that there is impunity for any Russian operative murdering somebody in another country who is considered to be a traitor to Russia. So, I mean, it's just very clear. It's a publicly declared intent to do this. And if you look around the world, it's a very, very long list at the moment. And I just think that President Putin wanted to press the reset button with Putin. It didn't work. He got nothing out of it. David Cameron wanted to do the same, wanted to do more trade with Russia. It didn't work. We need to be walking into this with our eyes wide open.
Right. Well, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, will be answering an urgent question on this in the Commons. Thank you both very much.
Dominic, sorry to interrupt you. I was going to take you live to the House of Commons where we are expecting the Foreign Secretary to begin speaking.
On Her Majesty Government's policy towards Russia.
The Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge and Malling, for raising this important matter. And although he's asked a general question about Russia, let me immediately say there is much speculation about the disturbing incident in Salisbury, where a 66-year-old man, Sergei Skripal, and his 33-year-old daughter, Yulia, were found unconscious outside the Maltings shopping centre on Sunday afternoon. Police, together with partner agencies, are now investigating. Honourable members will note the echoes of the death of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006. And while it would be wrong to prejudge the investigation, I can reassure the House that should evidence emerge that implies state responsibility, then Her Majesty's Government will respond appropriately and robustly. Although I hope honourable members on both sides of the House will appreciate it would not be right for me now to give further details of the investigation for fear of prejudicing the outcome of that investigation. Mr. Speaker, this House has profound differences with Russia, which I outlined in the clearest terms when I visited Moscow in December. By annexing Crimea in 2014, igniting the flames of conflict in eastern Ukraine, and threatening Western democracies, including by interfering in their elections, Russia has challenged the fundamental basis of international order. And this country, under successive governments, has responded with strength and determination. First, by taking unilateral measures after the death of Litvinenko, expelling 4 Russian diplomats in 2007, suspending security cooperation between our respective agencies, and then by leading the EU's response to the annexation of Crimea and the aggression in Ukraine, by securing tough sanctions coordinated with the United States and other allies, targeting Russian state-owned banks and defence companies, restricting the energy industry that serves as the central pillar of the Russian economy, and constraining the export of oil, exploration and production equipment. Whenever those sanctions come up for renewal, Britain has consistently argued for their extension, and we shall continue to do so until and unless the cause for doing so is removed. These measures have inflicted considerable damage on the Russian economy. Indeed, they help to explain why the Russian economy endured 2 years of recession in 2015 and 2016. As the House has heard repeatedly, the UK government has been in the lead at the UN in holding the Russians to account for their support of the barbaric regime of Bashar al-Assad. We have supported, the UK has been instrumental in supporting Montenegro's accession to NATO and in helping that country to identify the perpetrators of the Russian-backed attempted coup. This country, the UK, has exposed the Russian military as cyber criminals in their attack on Ukraine and elsewhere. As I say, Mr. Speaker, it is too early to speculate as to the precise nature of the crime or attempted crime that has taken place in Salisbury yesterday. But I know members will have their suspicions. And what I will say to the House is that if those suspicions prove to be well-founded, then this government will take whatever measures we deem necessary to protect the lives of the people in this country, our values and our freedoms. And though I am not now pointing fingers, because we cannot, Mr. Speaker, as you'll understand, point fingers, I say to governments around the world that no attempt to take innocent life on UK soil will go either unsanctioned or unpunished. It may be that this country will continue to pay a price for our continued principle in standing up to Russia, but I hope that I will have the support, and this government will have the support of members on both sides of the House in continuing to do so. As I say, however, Mr. Speaker, we must await the outcome of the investigation. In the meantime, I should like to express my deep gratitude to the emergency services for their professionalism of their response to the incident in Salisbury.
Fortunately, the Foreign Secretary arrived slightly later than scheduled and addressed the House for slightly longer than the time limit allows. But by virtue of my generosity of spirit, he has thus far escaped unsanctioned in respect of either offence, though his acknowledgement of same would, of course, be appreciated by the House. And I must now make some allowance for the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornbury. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Only when we've heard Mr. Tugendhat, of course, Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very good of you to accord this urgent question, and I welcome very much my right honourable friend's tour of the world and the various abuses that we are dealing with from Russia at the moment. And though it is, as he rightly says, too soon to point fingers at Salisbury, from Salisbury to Moscow, it is quite clear that we are seeing a pattern in Russian behaviour. Indeed, Heidi Blake of BuzzFeed, a journalist who has been researching this subject intensively over a number of years, has come up with 14 deaths, which she attributes to Russian elements. There are others who have pointed this out. Only today, Shawshank Joshi, a researcher at the Royal United Services Institute, has pointed out that murder is a matter of public policy in Russia today. And indeed, my right honourable friend and indeed his colleague on the ministerial bench, Alan Duncan, was absolutely right in criticising the murder of Alexander Nevtsov only recently. And so we are seeing a pattern here of what the KGB would refer to as demoralise, destabilise, bring to crisis and normalise. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a form of soft war that Russia is now conducting against the West? That its use of so-called fake news, more often known as propaganda and information warfare, is part of that? And does he agree with me that this requires a whole-of-government response, and his government, his department, is best placed to lead it?
Foreign Secretary. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he is indeed correct that Russia is engaged in a host of malign activities that stretch from abuse, murder of journalists, the mysterious assassination of politicians. I'm glad that he mentioned Mr. Nemtsov. I was privileged to pay tribute to his memory at the site of his murder on the bridge in Moscow only in December. It is clear that Russia, I'm afraid, is now in many respects a malign and disruptive force, and the UK is in the lead across the world in trying to counteract that activity. And I have to say that it is sometimes difficult, given the strong economic pressures that are exerted by Russia's hydrocarbons on other European economies, and the difficulties we sometimes have in trying to get our points across. But we do get our points across, and there has been no wavering in the sanctions regime that has been opposed by European countries, and nor indeed will there be such wavering as long as the UK has a say in it. And I must say to him in conclusion about the NSC, about the cross-government review. It's an interesting idea. I will certainly take it away and look at it. As he knows, the National Security Council repeatedly has looked at our relations with Russia, and they are amongst the most difficult that we face in the world. But I can assure him that we will certainly be looking at it again, and I'm afraid that the events in Salisbury may very well, and again, we must be very careful in what we say because it is too early to prejudge the investigation. But if the suspicions that I know on both sides of the House prove to be well-founded, then it may very well be, Mr. Speaker, that we are forced to look again at our regime, our sanctions regime, and other measures that we may seek to put in place.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for granting this urgent question, and may I thank the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee for securing it. We are all in this House extremely concerned about the incident in Salisbury yesterday, and I hope that I'm sure that we all hope for the recovery of Mr. Skripal and his daughter. And both sides of the House, I'm sure, will join me in praising the professionalism and, quite frankly, given the nature of previous poisonings, the bravery of the emergency services who've dealt with this incident. And as the Secretary of State has said, it has disturbing echoes of the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko 12 years ago. And it comes after the exposure last June by BuzzFeed News of the fact that since 2012, 14 individuals considered hostile to the Putin regime have died in mysterious circumstances on British soil. However, the investigation of this particular incident in Salisbury has only just begun, and I don't believe that it's appropriate for us to indulge in speculation whilst the investigating authorities are still doing their job. So I will not ask the Secretary of State any specific questions about that incident or the government's response to it, although I'm sure that the time for those questions will come and come soon. However, I do want to ask him two other related questions. He talks about working across Europe in relation to sanctions. Perhaps he can help us with, as we leave the European Union, how we're going to continue to work with our European allies on sanctions. Secondly, on the issue of Russian human rights abuses, the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Bill is currently upstairs in committee. There right now, the government is resisting an amendment that would enable Britain to sanction individuals who perpetrate gross human rights abuses, like those who tortured Sergei Magnitsky to death in a Moscow jail in 2009. So can the Secretary of State explain why the government is taking such a negative stance against our Magnitsky amendment? Surely it should be supporting it. Thirdly, on President Putin's speech yesterday, the Secretary of State, like me, will I'm sure have heard it and have been disturbed to hear Putin boasting about the proficiency of Russia's new nuclear weapon systems, all in response to Donald Trump's planned expansion of America's nuclear arsenal. And both are driving a coach and horses through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So can I ask the Secretary of State what the government is doing to urge all parties to renew their compliance with that vital international treaty?
She is quite, first of all, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable lady is quite right to put the emphasis that she does on the INF, the Intermittent Nuclear Forces breaches that we are now seeing, and the risk to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was one of the great achievements of the post-war order. And it is certainly the case that the UK, in New York, in Moscow, we are making with our American friends, we are making the case that it is time to bring the Russians firmly to heel. There is no doubt that there is a great deal of anxiety about what is now happening. It is not fundamentally in Russia's interest. She makes an interesting point, particularly about so-called Magnitsky amendments that I know that honourable members on both sides of the House are interested in tabling, as she rightly says, the sanctions bill is now at a report stage. We will look at all such proposals with an open mind. We're very interested in trying to address the issue of those who grossly abuse human rights, and that's what everybody wants to achieve. As it is framed at the moment, the bill a fortiori tackles such gross abuses, since it tackles all those who abuse human rights. But I'm conscious that the House wishes to go further, and we are certainly happy to look at that.
Mr. Keith Simpson. Can I follow the example of the Shadow Foreign Secretary and say that I don't intend, as a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, to ask the Foreign Secretary details about the recent incident? But would he agree with me that you can see the direction of travel over a decade now of the Putin regime, that the ability of them to murder people that they regard as traitors is in the finest traditions of the KGB, NKVD, etc. And can he actually tell the House the measures that the British government have taken?
Well, that bear an urgent question in the House from Tom Tugendhat about Russia and about the links with the poisoning, suspected poisoning in Salisbury. And we heard there from the Foreign Secretary saying that Russia is a malign and disruptive force in the world, and that if evidence emerges of state responsibility, the government will respond accordingly. No attempt to take life on British soil will go unsanctioned or unpunished. Obvious concerns in the House there that there could potentially be links to Russia. This is something that the Russian authorities and indeed the Russian embassy in the UK have strongly denied today.
Towards the UK is quite as hostile as it is.
Sir Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, my thoughts go to Mr. Skripal and his daughter, who we hope recovers. Does this not demonstrate the different types of threats that we face that are not always obvious, they are not always traceable, and it's not a classic Article 5 scenario? But, of course, this type of scenario is not unknown to our allies in the Baltic states. So does this not kind of cut to what's at the heart of the modernising defence programme in terms of how we protect human assets like Mr Skripal in this country? Can the Foreign Secretary tell us if this type of scenario will lead to a review of how we best protect these people up and down the United Kingdom?
If I may say so, I think the honourable gentleman makes a very perceptive point about the way in which attacks like this actually, of course, don't only affect the UK, but many of our NATO allies. And we will certainly be coordinating our response, if indeed it turns out to be, as many suspect, we will indeed be coordinating our response with our NATO allies. As he asks about how do we protect such individuals, I must really tell him that that is obviously not something that he would expect me to comment on in the House of Commons, but we do our best to give such individuals the protection we can.
Mr Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement, which highlights the very real problems that we are now encountering in our relations with Russia. He will be aware that when the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament was reformed, we announced immediately that one of our priorities was to carry out an inquiry into Russia's covert activities and whether we had the appropriate responses to it. He may agree with me that that is a matter which now requires perhaps a greater degree of urgency, and I would therefore ask him to do everything possible to facilitate that inquiry and ensure that it can get underway as soon as possible.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and I know he's been, from his vantage point as chair of the ISC, he's been following this very closely, and I will certainly undertake to get back to him on that matter as soon as possible.
Vivek Cooper.
The Foreign Secretary rightly just said that no attempt on an innocent life on our soil should go uninvestigated or unpunished. And I would not expect him to comment on the investigation that is underway at the moment, where we all obviously have concerns for the welfare of 2 individuals. But what about the other 14 cases that several members have now raised of suspicious deaths, where the UK authorities in many of these cases have concluded that these were suicides, despite the fact that there has now been considerable reported evidence, including in the BuzzFeed report, of further evidence that casts serious doubt on those conclusions, and also the fact the claims that the US intelligence may have provided further evidence to the contrary in these individual 14 cases, and there are serious questions about whether the police investigations were thorough enough. Will he now, as a result of what he said, discuss urgently with the Home Secretary whether an NCA investigation or other form of police further investigation and review of all of those 14 cases should now take place?
I must say that the right honourable lady is perfectly right, that there are, and indeed as my honourable friend from Tunbridge pointed out himself, there are a number of deeply troubling cases, Mr Perapachilny, for instance, and to the best of our knowledge, at present, there is no further evidence that points in the direction of criminality But I think what she says is very important, and we will certainly follow it up, and I will certainly have that discussion with the Home Secretary.
John Whittingdale.
It is almost exactly 4 years since the annexation of the sovereign territory of Ukraine in Crimea by Russia. It is 2 years since the public inquiry concluded that President Putin almost certainly approved the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. Is it not clear, therefore, that existing sanctions are failing to deter Russia, possibly even from carrying out further assassinations on British soil, and that the time has come to impose far tougher sanctions against targeted individuals associated with President Putin's regime?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and I think obviously we cannot prejudge the outcome of this investigation, and that would not be right. But clearly, if the, as I have said repeatedly, Mr. Speaker, in the formula I've used, if the suspicions of members on all sides of this House are indeed confirmed, then that is going to have to be one of the options that we look at.
Swinson.
I mean, these developments are clearly deeply concerning, not only in Salisbury, but also the Heidi Blake reports about the potential of multiple wider pattern of assassinations on UK soil by the Russian regime. And I welcome the fact that the Foreign Secretary, in response to the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, is going to look into those particular cases further. But I do want to press him on this point about assets, because other countries have taken a tougher line on the assets of Russian nationals than what we do here in the UK, and particularly in London, where there is a high concentration of these assets. And will he look again at what can be done, not only on cases where we've yet to have further investigation, but also on past cases where we already know many of the facts, such as Magnitsky?
I will certainly look at what she proposes, but I have to say that the UK leads the world in cracking down on money laundering and those who we do, and exposing the beneficial ownership of accounts across the world. That is something that we are trying to do, and if it is possible to expose further such illicit activity in London to hold people to account, then, or indeed anywhere in the UK, then of course we will do so.
James Brokenshire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise that the Foreign Secretary will be constrained in what he can say, but at a time when focus has understandably been directed at confronting terrorism, can he reassure that he and other Cabinet colleagues will see that the Security Service and our other intelligence agencies devote appropriate resources and attention on the activities of Russia and other foreign governments within the UK and the potential threat they pose?
My right honourable friend, I think, speaks for many people on both sides of this House in wanting to see our intelligence services, who are one of the great global assets of this country, properly funded, particularly now, not just in a war against terror, of course, but in the struggle against malign Russian activity.
Chris Bryant.
I don't think that the government has been robust or consistent enough over these last few years, and I've said it for a long time. Putin's violent record is a matter for all to see. Beslan at the Moscow theatre, in Crimea, Ukraine, and Anna Politkovskaya, many journalists, Sergei Magnitsky, Boris Nemtsov, and so on. And the truth is that this government has repeatedly just shrugged its shoulders. After the Litvinenko inquiry found that Putin was personally responsible, the government did absolutely nothing in response to that. And what happens when a murdering dictator is told that nothing's going to happen? They just do it all over again. So I would urge the Foreign Secretary to think long and hard about a proper Magnitsky Act, which many other countries have adopted already. Let's make it absolutely clear to Russia, you cannot kill people on our soil with impunity.
I certainly agree with the sentiment that the honourable gentleman has just, the last sentiment he expressed. I don't agree that the UK stood by and did nothing after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. On the contrary, we have led the world in tough action against Russia, and we have, both at the UN and in the EU, we have been in the forefront of those calling for tough measures against Putin's Russia, and I made exactly those points in Moscow when I saw Sergei Lavrov, as some honourable members may recall. As for his substantive point about a Magnitsky Act or Magnitsky amendment, as I said earlier on in answer to another colleague opposite, we are certainly willing to look at sensible proposals.
James Duddridge. Mr. Speaker, is the Foreign Secretary concerned, as I am, about Russian attacks on critical infrastructure in the United Kingdom going forward, and conscious that the Economic Secretary of Treasury is probably here more as a Member of Parliament for Salisbury, but is the Foreign Secretary particularly concerned about financial services infrastructure? As we carry less cash and chequebooks, we are reliant on our electronic cards.
Absolutely. It is clear from the NotPetya attack and others that Russia is certainly prepared to attack our infrastructure, and we should guard against that possibility with absolutely every preparation that we can.
Ben Bradshaw.
Speaker, I may have misinterpreted the question from the Chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, but it did leave me with the worrying impression that the government is resisting the attempts by that committee to hold an investigation into Russian interference. So I'd be grateful if the Foreign Secretary could reassure the House on that point. And perhaps he could also tell the House the BuzzFeed investigation was published last June. What did the government do then?
A couple of points. There's no attempt to resist any investigation. On the contrary, on the contrary, this government has, as I've told the House repeatedly, mounted the strongest possible resistance across the world to Russian aggression and interference. And as I think honourable members will readily concede, there are plenty of other governments that trade very freely with Russia, that oppose sanctions, that are massively dependent on Russian hydrocarbons, and it is up to the UK to stand up for decency and to resist what Russia is doing.
Richard Benyon.
Mr. Speaker, as someone who's campaigned for some time on the so-called Magnitsky campaign, can I say that the Sanctions and Money Laundering Bill does offer an opportunity to have the full Magnitsky, as opposed to Magnitsky Light, which we got last year in another piece of legislation. I think the opposition's amendments were well intended, but can be improved on. But can I tell my right honourable friend that at report stage, there will be an opportunity for the whole House to come together and give a very clear message, and I urge him, with all the measures that I can, to listen to all sides, because this is an issue that concerns people right across this House.
My right honourable friend is quite right that this is an issue that greatly exercises members on both sides of the House, and as I've said repeatedly, it's an issue that we will certainly address, and we will try to find a way forward that addresses members' concerns.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's response to Sir Robert Owen's findings on Alexander Litvinenko were criticised at the time for not providing a sufficient deterrent effect. Whatever his view on whether the government has taken action so far, does not this increasingly comprehensive picture, no matter what the findings in relation to Mr. Skripal come through in time, does this not show that the deterrent effect which the government has desired is not working and much more is needed?
I certainly think, first of all, we need to wait the outcome of the investigation, as I think all honourable members would. In the case of Sergei Skripal and his daughter, and let's wish them every possible good fortune in their recovery. We, in this government, obviously are going to look very carefully at whatever we can do to stop such a thing happening again, and it is absolutely right that we should consider, if things as are suspected by honourable members on both sides of the House, it may be that we will have to come forward with much tougher measures, but obviously we can't prejudge the investigation. I think the point I would make, the most important point I would make, is that the UK is in the lead across the world in standing up against Russia, and it may well be that that explains the particular hostility that we are currently having to endure. And all I will say to the House is I think it is worth it for this country to carry on with what it's doing, standing up to Russia, even if it exposes us to this kind of threat and this kind of challenge.
Sir Edward Lee.
Over the years, I've tried to understand the Russian position, particularly the Russian attitudes on the right of self-determination of the Russian majority in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But the way to preserve peace with Russia is peace through strength. There's no point giving commitments to the Baltics without hardware and men on the ground. So will the Foreign Secretary echo the words of the Defence Minister, the member for Bournemouth sitting next to him now, in the debate on the estimates last week, that spending 2% on defence was not enough?
I'm not going to join him in calling for an increase in another department's budget right now, though I think 2% is absolutely right that we should be spending at least 2% on defence. I would say to him, though, that out of that 2% we are able to fund, the Honourable Lady opposite says from the Secretary position we should spend it properly. We are spending, for instance, we are spending on 800 UK serving men and women in Tapa, in Estonia, on the front line with Russia, giving reassurance to a vital NATO ally. And that is what the UK is doing. And believe me, the Russians know it. The Russians know that we're doing that. The Russians know that we're in the lead in calling for the French and other EU countries to step up to the plate and also deploy in the Baltic. They know that we're in the lead in standing up for our friends in that part of the world. And yes, it may be that we in this country are paying a price for that. But we are not going to resile from that commitment.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the apparent poisoning of Mr. Skripal and his daughter, can the Foreign Secretary tell us if the toxicology report will be made public, and if so, when?
Good question. I must respectfully tell the Honourable Lady that, as I said right at the beginning of my statement, I'm not going to give a commentary on the investigation.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the work that Britain's National Cyber Centre does in resisting cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure here in the UK from Russia? But what I'd also like to ask him is, how does he categorise such attacks? Are they just nuisances we have to learn to live with and deal with, or are they, as some would say, acts of war?
A very perceptive question. I increasingly think that we have to categorise them as acts of war, and that means that we need to have elaborate a new doctrine of response and a new doctrine of deterrence as well, and we certainly are. And that was one of the conclusions that we took in the NSC a few months ago.
Emma Reynolds.
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary speaks of the UK leading the way on EU sanctions on Russia, and I want to press him on this. When we leave the EU, we lose our seat at the table, and we have continued to, in the 6-monthly review of these sanctions, push for renewal of those sanctions. How will we exert influence when we leave the EU, and what will be the legal status of those sanctions during the transition period?
As she knows, and I think she may have been in the House when we introduced the sanctions bill, and I explained that we may be leaving the EU, but we are not leaving Europe, and we will be intimately involved in the development of sanctions and other foreign policy, and that is because that is the intention not just of the UK, but of all our European partners. Fully half EU sanctions listings depend on UK intelligence. We are an integral part of the sanctions environment in Europe, and we will continue to be so.
Sir Desmond Swain.
We could speak softly if we carried a big stick. So wasn't the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War utterly misconceived?
Mr. Speaker, I respectfully disagree with my right honourable friend in the sense that I don't, appalling though recent events have been, and as I say, we don't know exactly what has taken place in Salisbury, but if it is as bad as it looks, it is another crime in the litany of crimes that we can lay at Russia's door. But I, for myself, as somebody who grew up in the Cold War, resist the comparison between events today and the misery and the horror of the gulags and the suffering of the peoples of Eastern Europe that I remember. And I don't think we should necessarily equate the conflict and the difficulties we have today with Russia with the existential threats that we faced during the 1970s and 1980s.
Mrs. Madeleine Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary is right to say that the current situation is not as it was in the Cold War. But is it not time to have an open and honest dialogue with the British people about how Russia uses instability, uncertainty and violence across the continent to have a hybrid warfare, which is not peace, but it's not war? And that is the situation that we're in. That conversation needs to be had. Will he lead it?
As the Honourable Lady will know, the Prime Minister herself said in her Mansion House speech on this very matter, she set out very clearly her deep anxieties about the way Russia is behaving. What we need to do is to concert international activity, to sanction individuals who are part of Putin's regime, and to keep the international community focused on exactly the points that the Honourable Lady makes. And believe me, there is growing support around the world for what she says.
Mr. Philip Holloway.
Having listened to today's exchanges closely, I'm sadly struggling to avoid the conclusion that Russia has now reached the point where it has little or no respect for Britain's foreign, defence and security policy. If I'm wrong, will the Foreign Secretary tell me why I'm wrong?
I have to disagree with my honourable friend, because I believe that actually what's happening is that the UK is in the front line of a struggle between two value systems. Russia, as the Honourable Lady opposite said earlier on, is determined to impose its own way of thinking, particularly on the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe, on the countries of the former Soviet Union. They wish to. Russia is effectively revanchist, and it is the UK that is in the lead in standing up. Many other countries would prefer to turn a blind eye. Many other countries would prefer to go to the St. Petersburg, Economics Forum, step up their trade in hydrocarbons, to ignore what is going on. Believe me, there are many countries around the table in the European Union who would like to do that, and many countries around the world that believe it is wrong to stand up to Russia and misguide it. We don't take that view. We take a principled view. We have been in the lead in imposing sanctions. We've been in the lead in standing up against Russian-supported aggression in Syria, and calling out Russia for what they did in the Western Balkans and in Montenegro. And we will be having a summit in this country in July to defend the Western Balkans and all those countries against Russian encroachment. It is the UK that is resisting, and it may very well be, as I've said to honourable members repeatedly, it may very well be that Russia will behave in a way towards us that is notably aggressive, Mr. Speaker. But we will not be bowed, and we will not allow such action to go unpunished.
Dr. Rupa Haq.
Mr. Speaker, the case has not only disturbing parallels with Litvinenko, but also with the BBC McMafia drama, as does the leaked report leaked to The Guardian and the organised crime and corruption reporting project last month that found millions linked to the Putin family and FSB's spy network laundered through the London property market. Can the Foreign Secretary not appreciate how simply patting himself on the back and saying that we're leading the world looks complacent, and that we simply must do more to promote financial transparency?
I certainly agree that there is more that can be done to promote financial transparency, but the UK is second to none in doing that across the world.
Paul Masterton.
Mr. Speaker, does the Foreign Secretary share my concern at the basing of Sputnik in Edinburgh, from where it spreads misinformation and peddles conspiracy theories to foment division in the UK? And would you agree with me that it's incredibly disappointing that current MPs and former First Ministers give Russia Today and Sputnik a pretence of credibility that they do not deserve?
Mr. Speaker, I must say I think the honourable gentleman makes an excellent point, and I think members on all sides of the House should think long and hard before they appear on Russia Today, which is clearly a vehicle of Kremlin propaganda.
Toby Perkins.
Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary, as many other people, has spoken
powerfully about the extent to which Russia, whilst we are not clearly at war with them, can only be seen as an enemy of the best interests of the United Kingdom. On that basis, is it not time to review whether we continue to sit on the UN Security Council, have the Russia in a position where they're able to decide whether or not actions that we take with our military are lawful?
I must say, I think that if things turn out to be as many members, I think, on both sides of the House suspect that they are, to return to that formula, I think we will have to have a serious conversation about our engagement with Russia. And for my own part, I think it will be very difficult to see how we can, thinking ahead to the World Cup this July, this summer, I think it will be very difficult to imagine that UK representation at that event could go ahead in the normal way, and we would certainly have to consider that.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, the southern gas corridor, which is currently under construction by BP, stretches from Azerbaijan to Italy with spurs across Europe, which will end the reliance on Russian gas, but is a threat to Russia's potential finances. Could he therefore undertake a review of the security of that pipeline to ensure that Russia cannot interfere with it, so that Europe can then get its proper gas supplies in an appropriate way?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to focus on gas supplies and the vital, the use, the political, strategic use that Russia makes of those supplies. And I will certainly look at the point he raises about the Azerbaijan pipeline.
Chris Evans.
International arrest warrants are still outstanding for those two people alleged killings of Litvinenko. There is no chance of extraditing them to this country. Yesterday, regardless of what we've seen, was poisonous gases or substances on the streets of Britain which could have caused harm to our citizens. How can he guarantee, if he cannot bring Litvinenko's killers to justice, that those who perpetrated yesterday's crime will equally be brought to justice?
Mr. Speaker, obviously we must leave it to the police and to the security services to do what they can to bring the perpetrators of yesterday's crime or attempted crime to justice.
Andrew Bridgen.
Speaker, here in the UK we often say that pride comes before a fall. In Russia it's rather different. They say if you have no pride, you will surely fall. Would my right honourable friend reassure the House that in the Foreign Office's dealings and other good departments with Russia, they take full account of the Russian psychology, which only respects strength?
Yeah. My honourable friend is entirely right, and that is why the UK has been at the forefront of those calling for a robust approach to Russia, both in the Baltics and in the Western Balkans.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the various concerns expressed here today about both today's events and the demonstration of Russian power which we saw earlier in the week, can the Foreign Secretary reassure us that discussions are taking place with our current member states in the EU and other allies about how to counter this?
If she will forgive me, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable lady makes a good point, but we must really wait the outcome of the investigation before we begin to draw conclusions with our friends.
Angela Smith.
Mr. Speaker, Russia has conducted cyber attacks against European countries, invaded the sovereign territory of Ukraine, abducted an Estonian border guard and murdered people on British soil. Given Putin's strategy of divide and rule, does the Foreign Secretary not agree that the UK response to Russian aggression needs to be robust, but would it also be most effective if it commands the support not just of his party and government, but the whole of this Parliament?
May I say I very much agree with both the manner and the content of what the honourable lady has said. I think it is, and I know that actually she speaks for the vast majority of people in both Houses of Parliament.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I urge the Foreign Secretary to think more not of the 1950s and the Cold War, but the 1930s, Personally, I believe that this period that we're passing through now is probably as dangerous as the 1930s. And Russia is the new Germany, and with a leader who is also very unpredictable and very determined to take on America and the free world. Could he therefore make sure that in this time when we've fragmented Europe, when America's distanced itself from the world stage in many respects, that he takes this issue seriously, because our colleagues on both sides of the House are absolutely right. The Russians will only listen to force and challenge.
Again, which is, and he is completely right that the Russians only respect force, and that is why the UK has been so absolutely insistent on the enhanced forward presence in Estonia, in supporting the Baltic countries, in resisting Russian aggression in the Western Balkans, in imposing sanctions for what they did in Ukraine. There are plenty of people, there are plenty of other governments that don't believe we should take this line, that don't believe the international community should be taking this line. It's the UK that has been in the lead and will continue to be in the lead.
Christian Matheson.
Mr. Speaker, much as I welcome the Foreign Secretary's strong condemnation of Russia and his reassertion of state sanctions, it's clear that they're not working. I'm concerned that there is a lack of political will to take the matters further, perhaps because there is an awful lot of Russian money sloshing around the City of London, driving the London property market and, dare I say, being donated in some occasions to political parties. Might it be the case that we can put further pressure on Putin by targeting those members of the Russian community over here who have perhaps brought some of that large amounts of money over, and by doing so put extra pressure on the Putin regime?
Mr. Speaker, let us await the outcome of the investigation. Let's get to the bottom of what has happened to Sergei Skripal and his daughter, and then let us certainly consider what more we can do.
Thank you. Order.
I've been getting away with it all